Welcome to the Transforming Trauma podcast. Transforming Trauma is presented by the NARM Training Institute. I'm your host, Emily Ruth, and I'm so glad you've joined us today. Hi, Transforming Trauma listeners. We're thrilled to share with you that the new NARM book is coming out on July 26th. The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma Using the Neuroaffective Relational Model to Address Adverse Childhood Experiences and Resolve Complex Trauma is written by our very own NARM creator, Dr. Lawrence Heller, and NARM senior trainer, Brad Kammer. This book is designed to promote personal and collective change. The intention is to make NARM accessible for anyone working with or dealing with complex trauma. Using therapeutic examples and helpful exercises, Brad and Larry demonstrate how NARM can serve as a catalyst to promote healing and post-traumatic growth. Whether you are a mental health or other helping professional, or simply interested in personal growth, we hope you will find this book useful in your professional work and personal healing. The Practical Guide for Healing Developmental Trauma is available for pre-order now on Amazon and other online book retailers. Please visit narmtraining.com/books to stay up to date on the latest news, promotions, and giveaways. And now for our interview. Ingrid Cockhren is the CEO at PACES Connection. PACES Connection is a social network that supports communities to accelerate the science of positive and adverse childhood experiences. Ingrid graduated from Tennessee State University with a Bachelor's of Science in Psychology and from Vanderbilt University's Peabody College with a Master's of Education in Child Studies, specializing in minority and impoverished children. Her research areas include African American parenting styles, positive and adverse childhood experiences, historical and intergenerational trauma, brain development, and epigenetics. Ingrid is currently an adjunct professor specializing in Black psychology and personality theory at Tennessee State University. Please enjoy this conversation with Ingrid Cockhren. Okay, I have the pleasure of sitting here with Ingrid Cockhren. Welcome to Transforming Trauma, Ingrid.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Absolutely. And did I say your name right?
That's right. Yep, Ingrid Cockhren. Yep.
Great. Well, I look forward to our time together today. And Ingrid, if it feels right to you, I wondered if I could start by asking, what would you like listeners to get out of our conversation today?
That's a good question. I would like for listeners to look into our organization, PACES Connection, and hopefully follow us. I would also like listeners to understand that our understanding of trauma and stress thus far has really been focused on the individual level. And so I really want the audience to begin to have a broadening of their understanding of stress and trauma, especially in our field, which focuses so much on children. So ACEs, we tend to think of childhood experiences only, but really that study is highlighting the lifespan all throughout the human lifespan. So I just want there to be just really a broadening of our understanding of ACEs science, the PACES movement.
Wonderful. Great. Well, is it okay if we just kind of dive right into what it is that you do and the work that you're doing in the field of complex trauma?
Sure. Let's dive in.
What would you like to share about what it is that you do?
So I am currently the CEO of pacesconnection.com, which is a social network that is focused on raising awareness of the PACES movement, PACES meaning positive and adverse childhood experiences. This movement and our org is really centered around the adverse childhood experiences study that highlighted that childhood adversity, initially 10 categories of adversity, were connected with lifelong implications that were centered around chronic illness and other social issues like incarceration, addiction, suicidality. And then the additional study, PCEs, positive childhood experiences, that outlines 7 conditions or experiences that really fostered a sense of resilience and also prevention when it came to adversity in childhood. And more importantly, that the lack of positive experiences was just as harmful, if not more harmful, than the presence of adversity in childhood.
Wow. I want to highlight that PCE part. And if we can come back to that, I'd love to hear more about that. That's something I'm not as familiar with. And so I'm curious if there's any listeners that aren't as familiar with ACEs. Could you kind of just give like a snapshot? What are ACEs?
Sure. So initially, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study covered 10 experiences that happened before the age of 18 that were connected with lifelong issues, potential lifelong issues. So the initial study outlined abuse and neglect, physical, emotional, sexual, and then also household conditions like having a caregiver with a mental illness or domestic violence. Since that initial study, there have been other studies that have really highlighted how, especially in Philadelphia, so the initial study was in California, and it was really focused on individuals who were reporting on their childhood. So they were adults. So it was a retroactive study. And then we look at future studies, especially what they call the urban focus, and such coded language, but really brought in our understanding of historical trauma or intergenerational trauma, as well as the implications of racism and poverty as ACEs as well. So when we say ACE today, it's not just those 10 categories that we thought about before. Now it is clear that adversity looks like several different things. It really depends on the person. And then we have to add not just those household and individual level, but think through poverty, community violence, racism, and issues that can then be passed along through generations, which we're really saying, I like to talk about how it has a dual focus. So there's the implications to the person, meaning I experience adversity, I'm more likely to have a chronic disease when I get older if I experience adversity before the age of 18. But then, that's so individual level. It really is what we're saying is that our cells are aging because of the stress, the toxic level of stress in our childhood, which then leads to all the things that come along with aging. So diabetes, heart disease. But when we get to the bigger picture and we look at intergenerational and historical trauma, what we're saying is that the changes in my body as an individual based on the conditions that I experience that lead to toxic stress then are kind of encoded in my DNA and then can be passed along to future generations. So the implications there are numerous, but it's essentially that the changes to the brain and body when you experience high levels of stress for long periods of time, especially during sensitive periods like childhood, that they matter, that it is connected clearly and proven at this point, connected to poor health outcomes, along with kind of the things that we already thought around depression or anxiety, incarceration, crime, things of that nature. Now we are connecting it to physical health. And that implication means that our cells are being changed, our DNA is being changed. And that leads to what it looks like for that to be passed along through several avenues, like obviously parenting, the environments that are created by parents who've experienced trauma, community level implications. So racism has created some communities that are living in relative comfort and others that are living in toxically stressful environments. And then other implications around the physical body is that when I have these epigenetic changes because of the stress that I experienced in my lifetime, that then those changes in DNA can then be passed along physically to future generations. And this means that for me, as an African-American woman who's a descendant of slaves, that especially with women, just because there's a lot of implications for women when it comes to biology in the transfer of DNA. So the experience of my great-great-great-grandmother as a slave would then be encoded in her DNA and thus in mine. And that brings on a whole new understanding of when people say things like African Americans and Pacific Islanders are genetically predisposed to high blood pressure or diabetes. Like, what are we really saying? We're talking about groups that have experienced high level of genocide, land theft, colonization, slavery, things of that nature.
Well, thank you. You explained some really complex concepts in a really short period of time. I really am appreciating that. That was kind of a loaded question and you shared really well with us. I have some understanding of this, but even just hearing you talk, I have a little bit better flavor for what we're talking about. And I want to highlight a little bit that the PCEs that you talked about. And that's not something I'm as familiar with. So I'm excited to hear more about that. We'll come to that in just a second. I'm chomping at the bit with that. But I wondered if you could boil it down. How would you define complex trauma?
Complex trauma generally is when an individual has what we would call, ACEs, obviously, but 3 or more of them.
Okay.
And so complex trauma means that if we look at a single child, let's say this child is living in poverty, and their mother is experiencing domestic violence, and their father has been incarcerated at least once due to that domestic violence.
Mhm.
And then they live in a neighborhood that has community violence. And this person is going to have complex trauma. And we're talking at this point 3 to 4 experiences before the age of 18 that would increase their level of stress and could potentially be toxic stress. And I say potentially because we're all different. And so our level of stress is tied to our individual makeup. And so what one person considers stressful may not be stressful to another. But generally, when we're talking about the human animal, situations that cause our heartbeat to race, our pupils to dilate, basically activating our fight, flight, or freeze response.
Okay, thank you. I hope this is okay to say, but as you were talking, it just made me think about there are going to be kind of outliers,
Mm.
like folks that grew up in some really challenging circumstances that for whatever reason, they're able to thrive. And so I think that's important for folks, especially folks like me. I'm, a white person that hasn't experienced a lot of these things. And so it could be easy for someone to look and say, oh, well, this person
Mm.
is thriving. It must be okay.
And that's where those positive childhood experiences come in.
Mm.
And so when we have those outliers, and let's be clear that they are outliers for the most part, when we're talking about issues of generational poverty and racism, it really is having an impact on that person's trajectory through life.
Mhm.
So outliers are going to be those who triumph despite those issues. And we could say that that may be an issue of that individual's resilience. Resilience is not a term I use often,
Mhm.
because I'm not exactly on board with the term resilience. But what I will say is that there's odds are in those resilient children that they have at least one person who is caring about them and is remaining constant in their lives despite their adversity, that they've had positive experiences, that they have some talent that someone sees in them, be it athletic or musical, or they might be cute. Well, we don't want to underestimate the power of attractiveness when it comes to
Mhm.
individuals. And these types of talents, or the fact that they have someone that's very much committed to their relationship with them, and these other pockets of positivities they might encounter, can really prevent or be a buffer against adversity that individuals experience.
Okay. I appreciate hearing about that because, I was having a conversation with someone just last week and we were talking about, two siblings
Mm.
that experienced they had a similar experience, at least maybe not the exact same, but a similar experience inside of the same home. But their trajectory, kind of like you said, was in very different directions. And so I think that's important to note that these positive childhood experiences, that there might be some element in there that one experienced that perhaps the other one did not.
Yeah, and that's very common, especially in childhood, especially when we add in our peer circles.
Mm.
So falling in with the wrong peer in your early life can have a real impact on your trajectory,
Sure.
especially if that peer has parents who are more permissive or have environments that that child may be exposed to that they wouldn't be exposed to at home. Obviously, school environments matter, bullying. And then we also just have our individual temperaments and things of that nature that make us more susceptible or resistant when it comes to adversity as well.
Okay. So I wondered if we could talk a little bit about what led you to this work, the work that you're doing. And if I can just say you're the CEO at Paces Connection.
Yeah.
So what led you to the work that you're doing?
It's really been a long journey. I started working with children as kind of a fluke. When I was really young, my aunt owned a daycare center, and so I would help around there. And I had experienced my own adversity as a victim of child sexual abuse, probably around age 5 or 6. And so this really threw me off of my own trajectory. So I was kind of floating through life. And when I think around 2003, I started working for the state of Tennessee at a juvenile facility that held children aged 12 to 18. And to be there, they had to have committed either 3 felonies, rape, or murder. And I was working as kind of what we would call a CO, or a corrections officer,
Mhm.
for juvenile. And while I was there, I encountered a lot of children with a lot of different stories. For the most part, they seemed like what you would call typical children. They were funny, they were sweet, not all of them, but it was not what I was expecting.
Mm.
I was there for quite some time in that role, I think about 3 to 4 years before I moved into a different role. But in that time, I learned a lot. And one thing that stood out while I was there is that most of them were Black children.
Mm.
And so I thought that that was interesting. I was like, well, maybe this is a issue with Black parenting. And so I decided to go to school, plus the state of Tennessee was paying for it. So I went to Tennessee State University, and I work there now as a professor. But at the time I went as a student, my focus was intergenerational incarceration. And I wanted to know, why do so many African American children end up in our juvenile justice system? And from there, I saw that had a knack for academia, and I graduated there summa cum laude, and I was like, well, let's keep going. So I went to grad school at Vanderbilt University, also here in Nashville, Tennessee.
Mhm.
And at the time, they had the top college for human development, and that was Peabody College. And I went there for child studies, focusing specifically on African American parenting practices, because I wanted to, again, I was thinking this must be a parenting issue because
Mm.
so many African American children are going into this juvenile justice system, and what I consider to be harsh parenting, more spanking, higher rates of abuse, especially physical. And at the time, I just wasn't aware of how racist I was, just because I was not aware that I was being raised in a racist system. And so once I started to do research, then I began to understand what we're talking about, our parents who are experiencing the highest rates of racism in this country, right?
Right.
The darker your skin, the more racism you're going to experience. And so how do you raise a child in a racist system where you're preparing them to experience racism?
Right.
And by today's standards, this is mild compared to Jim Crow or Reconstruction and slavery, obviously. But parenting is something that's passed down through generations. So there is still remnants of what it would mean for me to be a parent of a slave in my parenting practices today as a Black person. And so Vanderbilt is where I learned about historical trauma and also the ACEs study. So then a light bulb went out. I was like, oh, okay, this is systemic. This is parenting being passed on through generations and parents adjusting to a racist system. This led me to kind of dig more into history as well and think through the actual things that people went through during this timeline. So in slavery, during that time, children started working at 6 as a slave in fields, in homes as domestic servants. The stakes were high.
Yeah.
Right. And so if a child was misbehaving in this time, if they looked at the wrong person in the eye, if they were playing too much, if they flirted with one of the white children or harmed them in some way or played too rough with them, that it could literally be life or death for someone. Maybe not the child, but definitely for the parent, or they could be sold off and separated. And
Mm.
so what kind of parenting would I need to employ to make sure that my child had very strict adherence to the rules,
Right.
right? The rules of this racist society. I need you to keep your head down. I need you to be quiet. All of these rules. And then if they acted like little children, what punishment would I need to use to keep them in line if it meant life or death?
And to keep them safe, like life or death. Yeah.
And also, what would my attachment be to that child, knowing that they would be, odds are, sold off, or that I would be sold off? How would I prepare them to live without me if I was sold off? These are things that we don't really think about in today's world. We condemn, and not just Black parents, but people parenting in poverty as well, Indigenous parents. And we think of it as, an individual issue. But for a time after I got my degree, I started to do in-home crisis counseling with lots of different families. So I worked with families of all income and definitely racial backgrounds. And I learned a lot during that time, and that it's really each parent is preparing their child to live in the world as they see it. So if I see my environment as hostile, stressful, then I'm probably going to be more strict or attempt to prepare my child for this hostile, stressful environment. A good example would be the Latino community and the African American community talking to their children about the police. It's going to be a very different kind of conversation than a white family talking to their child about the police. So that's because our society is structured differently based on race. And this, understanding of historical trauma really helped me to see that when we think about looking at certain groups as deficient, that we leave out the context of our society. There's plenty of research that will outline the poor outcomes and conditions in indigenous tribal areas, in reservations, in urban areas where it's mostly Black and Latino families. Even if we think about outside of that, parenting for Middle Eastern parents around the way they treat boys versus girls, or, all the different ways that we tend to kind of condemn certain groups parenting, we leave out the context of racism and culture. And we rarely engage in our understanding, I call it the 5 whys. So COVID is a great example. We got into this pandemic and then we began to see like alarming rates of death in the African American community. Okay, so why would they be passing away? And then people will say, well, they're more likely to live in poverty and have poor health outcomes. So having that, underlying conditions was a reason why they wouldn't be able to survive if they got the virus. So then the question is, well, why are African Americans more likely to live in poverty? Why are they more likely to have underlying conditions? And so then we dig a little deeper and we say, well, they're more likely to live in poverty because of past very clear housing discrimination and very clear wage theft. Our society is okay with paying people of color less money just because their skin is dark, right? So they could actually be more skilled. And this is a layover from slavery. We had very skilled artisans that were slaves that did work for their owners. Those owners reaped the benefits of that. They didn't get, trademarks or, they weren't highlighted for their skill. Their owner was. And this is something that's still the case today. We're totally fine with wage theft for people of color, especially people of color like immigrants, people who are not citizens of America. And so this wage theft has been happening since before our country was founded. We come to today and it's totally fine to pay people less. So now, of course, we have more of those groups living in poverty generationally, whereas others have benefited not from just their own work, but also from the work and all the things that other groups have given as far as wage theft, land theft, things of that nature. So other groups have generational wealth. And then we have those groups being compared against each other. We can't talk about poor economic outcomes or educational outcomes or housing issues or any of these issues without the context of race and our system being heavily reliant on capitalism. So then, of course, poverty.
Right. I really appreciate you exploring that with us. And I know there's so many more layers. I'm sure you could talk for hours, I'm sure, about this. But I really appreciate you kind of just highlighting some of the bullet points that are really important there. Is there anything else you want to say about that before we kind of shift in another direction?
Well, I would say that there's a term for this. It's called scientific colonialism. It is where we are looking at people through this scientific lens, but not having the context of our blind spot, basically. But then also, once we do that, then we write textbooks about it and we put it into medical schools and we educate people from this standpoint, then it becomes, very harmful to our society. So even our understanding of race, the fact that we believe that there are races of people comes from the 17 and 1800s when people decided to write about this and put it in textbooks and say that certain groups were savages and had no culture and certain groups were superior and civilized. And, this is where we get to the point where we say, well, this group is deserving and this group is not. And it's okay for us to enslave this group. It's okay for us to take this group's land because they are less than based on the science. And this continues today. If we came out, right, if we use COVID, for example, we would say, oh, Black and Indigenous people are more likely to pass away from this virus because they are somehow deficient based on their skin color, as opposed to the environments that have been created by our society that makes them more susceptible. We need to really change how we talk about these issues around demographics if we want to have a real conversation about issues of race and our societal issues as a whole.
Oh, that feels so important. That last piece that you shared, this idea that this group of people, this population is somehow inferior. That's why
Mhm.
they're not surviving, and really looking at what is the context. Like you said before, if we're not including the context, we're not talking about the right thing, I don't think.
Right, yeah.
Wow. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I'm curious if in the work that you're doing, that the focus has shifted. And I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about why that is, that you started and you were really talking about individual trauma and you've shifted in a way.
Yeah, so I started with the company about 3 years ago, and one of the things that I thought we needed to do our due diligence on internally was around DEI, and so this is prior to George Floyd, and so it was something that the our staff was interested in and, wanting to do more or put out more information about issues of race or other issues of intersectionality, right? So I agreed. I thought, yes, you do, but before you do, you need to have a compass for yourself. And this is something that I started as a consultant with many orgs, hospitals, schools. I help them to really understand before you do the work externally, you have to do the work internally. So we need to do some things before we say, oh, we're going to provide a resource of, anti-racist resource. And like, that sounds good, but because of things like scientific colonialism, you can believe
Mhm.
that you're doing good work when actually you're perpetuating stereotypes or not really talking about the real issues. So in our understanding of race in general, we tend to talk about certain groups as being deficient, but we don't talk about the trauma of white people that they've experienced, that they've inflicted on others in our context for America, right?
Mm.
There's many racial dynamics outside of this country I'm not aware, but in America, we're very race focused, whereas other areas might be more economically focused or kind of a caste system based on
Mm.
how much money. But in America, we're really, really race focused. And that's because of kind of our origins as a country. And so it is a blind spot for us. Even me, like I said, as an African American woman, when I started in the work, I was like, well, this is because of bad parenting and then I had to go through a process of understanding stress and trauma to get to the point where, well, no, this is a systemic issue that any group would have these same issues if they had gone through the same environment and history. So I did some internal work with the staff around training, and then we formed a race and equity work group. And from that work group, we decided that we wanted to have a historical trauma series that highlighted the different regions of our country and kind of what are the drivers of social determinants of health based on region. And so that series was very popular. And this made me think, well, and just to give a little bit further context, the reason why we decided to do this is because of the growing resistance to critical race theory in schools.
Mm.
It is kind of a nothing issue because critical race theory is not really taught in K through 12. But more importantly, it was just, you look on TV, I'm in Tennessee, so we made the news several times where people were going
Mm.
to their school board meetings and falling out on the floor and police had to be called because basically white parents are saying that they don't want their children to be traumatized by telling this narrative of the past that is deeply rooted in racism. Like, I don't want my child to feel bad about being white. That is a quote from, parents that have
Yeah.
pushed back against so-called critical race theory being taught in school. And this made me think, people don't know the history and they need to, because if they had a very good understanding of history, especially children in schools,
Right.
there would be a very different way that a child would grow up and see the world if they were very clear of their history. We have a very sugar-coated history around racism. We hit the highlights, but we're not aware of how pervasive racism is to the point where race is literally designing the environments that we live in. That, people think that they're HBCUs, right? Historically Black colleges and universities, because Black people want to separate themselves, not because they really couldn't go to college. So they had to create their own. And they
Mhm.
really didn't create their own, but nice white people helped them to create their own. So, this is what happens when you don't tell accurate history. People think that there are Chinatowns because, people wanted to separate themselves. But again, I can't run a business with all of the policies against me as someone who's immigrating from an Asian country. Housing discrimination, again, racism, then pushes me to be with others like me so that I can have some peace. Right? People in the Midwest, when I would go and talk to them and they would say, well, there's no Black people in my town. And I would say, well, why do you think that is? Because when they tried to settle in your town, they were run out violently.
Right.
And so that lack of history leaves a big gap for people to make assumptions. And our education system is promoting character, right? So they're saying, well, if you have good character, you make good decisions, then you should prosper. And if that's the message that you're getting, and then you see groups that are, having these disparities, then you'll say, well, it's because they're not making good choices. You'll say because they don't have good character. And that those few outliers that you talked about before, that they had good character, right? And that's why they were able to prosper, because racism didn't matter. And that's not true. The truth of it is, it's hard as an individual to go up against the system. And that's why so few get through. And those outliers, not that they shouldn't be championed, but that they are flukes, not the norm. And so this understanding based on region, based on the history of a region, can then help people to say, okay, this is what's tied to our current issue around gentrification today, or why our healthcare system is not supporting all aspects of our society, or why we have issues of suicidality, issues of addiction. And so that series was pretty popular, and it has created a podcast to support it. And then it really helped us to think through, okay, this is something that people are interested in, not just the individual level, which we do well and still can do, but to talk through and to educate around and raise awareness around how trauma and stress is also kind of baked into our systems. And again, not just race, but also issues of poverty and definitely sexism, homophobia. All of these things are connected to systemic issues, because in the past, people were very blatant and explicit about the groups that they were targeting with their policies. Today, we can't do that anymore because of the Civil Rights Act. But we now are using more, when I say we, I mean our society and our government are using more coded language. We're still getting what we want to accomplish by addressing different areas of policy like housing, employment, that will still get us the outcomes that we want, which is that one group does better than others.
Yeah. Thank you for taking that time to just give us a better picture. And I can really appreciate the shift that your organization has made. I'm sure there was good work being done prior, but that this is a better picture and approach to really working in this way.
Yeah, both and.
Yeah. Yes. Both are important. True. Yeah. Thank you. So I wondered if you could share, are there any, stories in the work that you're doing that you feel might be important for our listeners to hear and learn from?
Well, there are so many stories. That's kind of our thing, storytelling. And so we have a sister site, ACEs2high.com, where we highlight the stories that are happening across the country where baby courts are doing better because they're bringing in trauma-informed practices, where schools are having more impact with their students because they're more relationship focused, where counties' work is really focusing on, again, relationship building and how that needs to be incorporated into the work that they're having that's focused on the opioid epidemic. And so there's so many stories. I would say there's not one that I can highlight other than, we're doing a lot of good work with connecting smaller communities with larger entities to support them. So we have a lot of healthcare corporations and other large nonprofits that are sponsoring communities to be involved in our cooperative of communities, which is basically a learning collaborative and also a way to organize their data where they can see what areas of their communities are trauma informed and which aren't, and how to bring everyone into the fold when it comes to trauma-informed practices. And ultimately, what we're trying to get to is that we have a way to track outcomes as organizations become aware of trauma and begin to implement things that have been proven to have a positive impact on all of these kind of discussions that we've had around ACEs. So health outcomes, obviously educational outcomes, crime, addiction, suicidality. We're really looking to connect those smaller communities with those other sponsors so that we can have better health outcomes across the country. And internationally, we have some international communities as well. And through these kind of partnerships, these connections, people are better able to understand what trauma and stress looks like, and more importantly, begin to understand what it means to address it in a real way. And I think that's the key when we get into this space of, addressing racism and xenophobia and basically beginning to understand the systems approach, that there are systemic answers to these issues. The only problem I can say right now is that, we're very political as a country right now. And as we talk about issues of race and poverty, there is a definite pushback on this narrative that you would think people would be able to come together around supporting children and their development.
Right.
But that's not the case, because it does tie to these larger issues that I'm talking about, that our past, our issues around racism and sexism, how we have been exclusionary to certain groups. And so all of these societal issues intersect with these much larger beliefs and values around character, religion, obviously race. What does it mean to be a good parent versus a bad parent? All of these things are kind of rolled in there, and it has become political because of our past.
Yeah.
And it actually makes it harder for us to create these positive environments in an equitable way. And that's something I was prepared for, but not as much as we are in the current state of things at this time.
Yeah, it's kind of come to this point where hopefully more and more of our eyes are being opened to like what's really before us, and hopefully setting aside the political side of it and focusing on what you said, just focusing on helping humans, children that are out there.
And I won't even touch what that means when we get to issues of climate change
Yeah.
or, a pandemic, all of these things
Yeah.
that seem to be something that everybody can get behind and have been politicized, and it makes it harder to accomplish these things.
Yeah. On your sister's site, remind me the
acestoohigh.com.
ACEs Too High. That's right. So there's stories on there that we can go check out and understand a little bit more what's going on there. Well, I wondered if there was anything else that you've learned in the work that you're doing in your education about complex trauma that's really helped you, and something that you think others might need to know.
I would say that, especially as a new CEO, I've really learned that that internal work that we do as an organization helps us to do the external work. And so our transition has been a little rocky since I've come on, and also the change in the structure of how we approach, how we support communities has changed as well. And so this is definitely, along with COVID, has definitely made me think through what it means to have, healthy workplaces, so non-toxic workplaces. And so I think that might be something that I'm also looking forward to, diving into in the future, definitely starting with our own team
Yeah.
members and then moving outward. But I've noticed that a lot of people are struggling in their workplaces, obviously remote, the fear of being exposed to the virus if you're not remote. And then the kind of the racial reckoning that we had in 2020 has sparked conversations in workplaces that they're not prepared to have in workplaces. And so people have expressed that work has become kind of insufferable. And then just as we know more in general as a society, and we have gone through, 2 years of mourning, and we're mourning our old way of life, we're mourning people that we've actually lost. And then, of course, all of the disability that comes along with COVID too. So even those who survived may still have residual health issues. So there's just a wave of mourning. And that helps people to think through what's really important. And so a lot of people are working in spaces that are toxic. And that's why we have the great resignation, where people are just like, I don't have to do this. Yeah, I'm done with this. And what does it mean for organizations to be able to retain their staff? They have to create trauma-informed policies and practices to retain their staff in a time where people are just really aware of how short life is, how they want to spend their time, especially when they're experiencing high levels of stress just from a collective trauma in general. And then we add the stress of work on top of that. And then we add a racial reckoning on top of that. And then people are just kind of checked out, or they're burned out, and they're experiencing secondary stress and secondary trauma. And then we have a kind of a great resignation as people are moving either to not working, to taking a break, or moving to places that they believe are healthier for them. Kind of the mass exodus from the education sphere right now. And this very clear understanding that life is precious, that we have, finite time in this life, and that we want to be in places where we are appreciated, valued, we have lower levels of stress, and that, that there's more important things besides work. So,
Yeah. And I appreciate what I heard you say. It sounds like to create these healthier environments, these healthier organizations, the first step is really addressing our own experience, our own traumas of the individual work.
yeah, and it has been an experience. Paces Connection is not perfect, but we are addressing our issues. And so many organizations are not addressing their issues. So people are just, there's no outlet. So they
Mhm.
have issues around pay or race or, microaggressions that they're experiencing or, anything. There's so much there, gender pay gap, definitely power dynamics, being able to take off, things of that nature, all those things.
Right.
There's no outlet because they don't have a workplace that is informed. They might not have any idea around trauma-informed practices. But also, even if they are, again, they're driven by the bottom line. And so there's not much room for them to address those issues within their workplace. And we've also backed ourselves in a corner as a country around race to the point where we can't even talk about these issues in workspaces.
Yeah, thank you for kind of highlighting that. I do. I think there's so many that are going through these kind of transitionary periods, and it's important to talk about. Conversations are important to have. Well, thank you so much for your time. My heart is just feeling so open and full and appreciation for the work that you're doing and
Thank you.
yeah, and for taking this time with us. And I want to just give folks kind of a way to like connect with the work that you're doing. So in the show notes, we'll put some links. I don't know if you'd like to share if there was any others
Sure.
that you'd like us to have.
Definitely those two, pacesconnection.com and acestoohigh.com.
Mhm.
And in that way, they can interact with all of the resources that we have. Pacesconnection.com has probably the largest online resource of trauma-informed, PACES-informed information. And then, like I said, ACEs Too High is really story-focused. And you can also, at ACEs Too High, there's a survey for you to take where you can determine how many ACEs you have and what that means for you.
Yeah, great. And then I know you also have a podcast.
Yeah, so we have a podcast. It's live on Thursdays. I'm on Central Time, so it's 3 for me. So
Okay.
3 p.m. Thursdays Central Time.
Okay.
And it is called History, Culture, Trauma. And it's me and PACES Connections Director of Communities, Matthew Portell. And we really just talk about the state of the world and through the lens of how our history got us here and what culture really is. And so culture is really adaptations to your environment, and be it a very comfortable, prosperous environment or a toxic, stressful environment. And then we talk about how trauma manifests in our society and what it means currently. So you can definitely join us.
Great. And you said it's live like on Thursdays, is that right? And then can we listen to it after the fact?
We're on voiceamerica.com. You can always access us anytime. All of our
Okay.
past episodes are there, voiceamerica.com.
Great. Wonderful. Well, thank you again. I really appreciate you taking the time, Ingrid, and we'll keep watch on the work that you're doing and
Yes.
really appreciate you taking the time today.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us for today's episode. To find more about our guest and their work, check the show notes or visit us at narmtraining.com/transformingtrauma. The practical guide for healing developmental trauma is available for pre-order now on Amazon and other online book retailers. Please visit narmtraining.com/books to stay up to date on the latest news, promotions, and giveaways. Thanks to Andrea Klunder and the Creative Imposter Studios for producing and editing, to Tori Essex for our album art, and to Brad Kammer for the creation of this podcast. We look forward to building community, connection with you, and changing the world by transforming trauma.